Welcome to our new and regular viewers from all over the world. Broto Art Climate Science has returned for a program of unique sustainability conversations. Greetings Earthling is a transdisciplinary examination of the human scale of the climate crisis. In 8 sessions, we'll explore the social sciences as the collaborator for art thinkers to gain new perspectives on what it means to be human today in the existential threat of climate change. Make sure you tune in for all of our 8 sessions. I wanted to start us off with the concept of Earthling. We have presenters in this program who are Swedish, Indian, American, South African, Canadian. But in the largest sense, we are Earthlings, making our way in a finite world. When the world is divided by arbitrary borders and competing national interests, how can we muster a unified response to the threat? So joining us in conversation is a geologist, a middle school teacher, and a writer-philosopher to get us thinking about the power of being a global citizen and what that means. Before we get started, a special thank you to our critical and ongoing sponsors and private donors. As you know, Broto Art Climate Science is a program of the Cape Cod Center for Sustainability, which is a registered 501c3 charity. We have done this program online and for free. But that means we have to rely on our attendees to support us financially, especially for us tiny nonprofits in the COVID era when funding has evaporated. If you can help us, even with a small donation in support of this program and future art-sci initiatives by Broto, please click the link in the pop-up. Now, on with our panel inspired by global citizenship. Thank you for watching. Greetings, Earthlings. Tuning in for the latest conference from Broto Art Climate Science. My name is Ian Edwards, and I'm producer and host. Broto, as you know, is a substantive collaboration of art and science toward climate remedies. And since we started our conversations in 2018, that's manifested in these unique sustainability discussions, thinking about the nature of collaboration or scale or partnership with deep time or to nature. This particular conference is called Greetings Earthling. It's about the human scale of the climate crisis and brings in a host of social sciences as the foil for art thinking. I'm glad you're able to join for these 8 sessions. We'll be exploring sociology and anthropology, civics, psychology, and philosophy. We're kicking off things with a setup panel called Greetings Earthling to discuss definitions and scope and potential and prime discussions for the subsequent panels. What does global citizenship mean, and does it have implications for climate response? Marcia Bjornerud is a professor of geology at Lawrence University in Wisconsin and a frequent Broto collaborator. Welcome back. Previously talking to us about deep time and our relationship to nature. She is also the author of Timefulness, which is a beautiful book, and you should get it. Rick Gifford is one of the few US-based, UN-certified climate change teachers, and he is a science teacher. He teaches STEAM and design for grades 6, 7, and 8. Rick?
That's right.
Here in Provincetown on Cape Cod. So he's here in part as a youth proxy because he knows what kids are thinking these days. And Dr. Cori Wong is a writer and a philosopher. She leads diversity and equity and inclusion efforts at Colorado State University. She has a dual PhD in philosophy and women's studies. Welcome, everyone, to the show. No small feat here defining Earthling. A lot of other panels are zeroing in on existence and extinction and agency, but this discussion, I hope, can prime those later discussions. In this panel, I'm hoping we get into the ideas of definitions, general concerns, generational concerns, geopolitical and social constructs, nativism. You know, it's a broad subject, and how might global citizenship work? So let's start with some definitions. What are Earthlings? Do they exist? Go, Marcia.
Well, calling ourselves Earthlings can seem maybe a little bit gimmicky and cute, but I started doing this quite deliberately a couple of years ago when the idea that we might be able to colonize and even terraform Mars started getting quite a bit of traction among very educated and wealthy people, including Elon Musk, among others. And to me, the assertion that we could alter a planet in a way that would make it habitable within a couple of decades or even generations is so hubristic and reflects such a deep ignorance of and disrespect for the biogeochemical cycles that make life on Earth possible. So in saying to people, students and other groups that we're Earthlings is an assertion that we participate every day, whether we are aware of it or not, in these biogeochemical cycles that have kept the planet on an even keel. And so to me, an Earthling is anybody who does participate in biogeochemical cycles, whether human, plant, microbial, arguably even rivers, soils, rocks. So I use the definition quite broadly to emphasize the kinship that we do have with other living things and with the apparently inanimate world that we inhabit.
Yeah, we are biological entities on a very thin biosphere. So I think from a biological perspective, we qualify as an Earthling as well. Rick, you're dealing with kids all the time. Do young people have an idea of what an Earthling is, and what is that?
That's a really interesting question. I think they're coming of age in a time where they're starting to think about Mars exploration, in particular Mars, where we're seeing that. We're seeing new rovers, we're seeing helicopters, we're seeing the sort of vehicles that we associate with being on Earth actually on other planets now.
I actually think of Earthling as something aspirational. I struggle as a sustainability person to see how we can transcend borders and other kinds of constructs that are made up by a human society that are in the way of a climate response. So I actually think it's good sustainability rhetoric that we can think about Earthlings as a united front, which I don't think we have at the moment. Cori, what is conceptually an Earthling?
Yeah. Conceptually, an Earthling, I think you're all hitting it. I think my assumption is I would tend to go to living things that are on the planet Earth, but I would be willing to expand that to the soil and the rocks and the rivers and the seas and all of those things too. I honestly did not prepare for this panel thinking about the relationship between Earth and Mars and our human aptitudes or aspirations for colonizing another planet or immigrating, like intergalactic immigration. But I think that when it comes to global citizenship or sustainability rhetoric, like you're suggesting, Ian, that immigration and colonization are part of the context that helps me think about whether Earthlings conceptually is a helpful way for us to be thinking about the catastrophes that are affecting people or the disasters that we're trying to ward off by actually thinking sustainably about our planet Earth and all of the inhabitants on it. So one of the things that I think is important to suggest before we get too deep into the conversation, the way I'm thinking about Earthlings, is I have some caution and a little bit of hesitation about generalizing so broadly into a category of Earthling, because historically we know that the global political, social, economic, and environmental disparities that affect us across the planet are really drawn up by differences that are, Ian, you said, made up constructs, whether those are national borders or other identifiers that we make up. But if it's species or race or country, nationality, and those kinds of differences, I come from a feminist, anti-racist perspective that the differences we have are important. And so there is often a theoretical tendency to go to this idealization or generalization of, but what if we were all equal or all the same? And that has a tendency to erase a lot of the significant differences that prevent us from really thinking equitably and justly about the real lived material consequences of our actions and our intervention. I'm not a native scholar, but I am very familiar and indebted to Indigenous knowledges for understanding ways of thinking about the world. And so Marcia had mentioned kinship and the relationships that we have with all creatures and living things on the planet. And I do think that that's important. So I want to hold both of those, that thinking about a global relationship for all living beings is something that we can get from Indigenous practices that really hold a sustainable kind of understanding of how to be in a relationship with the planet. And then also a broad generalization has, we know historically, very real, concrete consequences that disadvantage some people and creatures way more than others. And if we pass that over, I think we're actually going to be setting ourselves up to miss some pretty big problems that we face here on our planet Earth before we run away to Mars.
Also, I wanted to suggest that I'm not thinking about erasing cultural differences. That, there are going to be many people with, varying different kinds of life experience. But I do see climate refugees at the borders and Syrian warfare as, a consequence of, Russian famine. Bad wheat harvests.
One of the concepts I've really been thinking about a lot is the idea of us entering a new geological era, which is the Anthropocene, where across borders, across nations, there's an indelible mark left on our planet. And whether that's plastic residues, whether it's microplastics on top of mountains, whether it's chemical changes to the ocean, biodiversity loss, and any of those, we're really at a unique marking point in history, in geological history, not just human history, but geological history, where there's things happening now that will never, we can't undo. And I think they're realizing the global extent of environmental catastrophe that we're facing on many, many levels, like what you said, Ian, whether it's failed crop harvests or microplastics or the oceans diminishing carrying capacity or any of the myriad issues that we're facing. They certainly impact they impact disproportionately, as Cori was saying. They impact disproportionately to people of color, to poorer nations and poorer areas and areas that are more vulnerable to climate change. But we see the effects of it everywhere.
Yeah, I agree. I think justice is going to be a theme in all of our panels, and something that we're not going to be able to fix in these 8 hours, but we can always certainly bring it up. We do have world governments like the UN and IMF and other internationalist bodies like global NGOs. We have the Sustainable Development Goals tackling issues like poverty and hunger and education, some of these high bar standards that we're looking at in this conversation. Is this an expression of being an Earthling, or is this something else?
Well, it's a start. I mean, it's recognizing how arbitrary these human-imposed borders are. Natural systems bleed into each other in complex ways, and some things are global commons, the atmosphere, the climate system, for example. So there are our self-imposed boundaries have absolutely no meaning to the natural systems that govern the way they behave. But it's not enough. In using this idea that we are Earthlings, I am not, to follow up on Cori's comments, saying, can't we all just get together? It's a reality check. We are Earthlings. We evolved here. We have very deep evolutionary roots. We are utterly dependent on the biogeochemical services provided to us by a very complicated system of systems. And so we absolutely need these global governance entities to embrace that idea. And so far, we haven't really managed to shift the paradigm radically to the acknowledgement that we are utterly embedded in these systems. I recently ran across a new report in the UK by a very eminent Cambridge economist, Sir Partha Dasgupta, who proposes that we acknowledge our economies are embedded in the biosphere. I mean, obviously, I agree, but the fact that that is a radical suggestion by a very eminent economist that he posits in a way that suggests it might actually be controversial shows how deluded we are. So yes, we must use the fragile international governance mechanisms we have, but what it will take is a really more fundamental change in culture and values and ethics, which I think is something we're going to get into a little bit more.
Yes, I mean, you and I have had conversations about this before. I recognize that there's an allegiance to a society that may not be the same as an allegiance to nature, and that there's a conflict there that's getting in the way.
Well, I was just thinking that the global entities and kind of a world governance structure to me is like a very macro view on the theme of justice. So I've already made it explicit, but I'm rooted in principles of justice and trying to think about what that looks like. And I think that having a global kind of perspective is necessary because we are all interconnected, and the consequences of one national project or endeavor or culture affects other people across the world. And so there has to be some level of, I think, accountability and responsibility if we're thinking about like global context for greater justice. And I do believe that justice is necessary for us to actually have sustainability. Like that's the other piece. So when I think about the consequences of if something that happens on one side of the planet affects people on the other side of the planet, we do need a kind of global approach to that. But that is just the same as a micro approach of like within a nation or within a neighborhood or within other relationships where we affect each other. And a lot of the consequences, just to go back to what was mentioned about like climate refugees or from an environmental justice perspective, the consequences that people are facing in certain poor countries or those that are going to be most devastated by climate change are really the consequences of actions of other nations. Again, to go to
True.
Colonization or exploitation. And so the natural consequences that we see in the environment are not separate from the political and economic priorities and histories that have happened from other places and people across the planet. So I think a global approach to this is absolutely necessary. So I wasn't trying to say we're all, one general Earthling thing, but the ways in which we understand our relationships to each other as Earthlings from a global perspective, I think is super necessary and critical for us to adequately address any of the historical things that have happened to move into a more sustainable and just future.
You know, I was thinking about COVID-19 and the global response to the pandemic and vaccination programs, and the idea that overnight we can, or within the year, discover something new, get a remedy, and get it out into the world and start to protect people. That is to me something interesting as a global movement. I didn't expect the whole world to adopt mask protocols, and of course some of them didn't, but the idea that we should change behaviors in such a big way overnight, cosmically anyway. So I do think that there's ways that we have responded as a species that suggests that we have one common cause. And that I've always wondered why climate has not been such a unifying cause. We have a concept called civil society, and in which we agree to these codes and social constructs like what money is or what laws are. And the news is filled with people who might be considered bad citizens. Do we have any ideas of what makes a good Earthling citizen, the qualities, mindsets, the priorities of an Earthling, and how they would express themselves?
One of the first things that comes to mind with this idea of Earthling is a concept of stewardship and of caring about beyond your own immediate needs.
Right.
I think your example with COVID-19 is a very valid one, is that almost overnight, the entire planet shifted to different health protocols, different financial protocols, different educational protocols. And this shift happened really in a very decentralized way. It almost went against the idea of one united world government. Now that was fractured. It was a fractured approach in many places, but still the lockdowns, the public health, the need to find alternative ways to work and to educate and to commute and to provide food for people. It all happened in very similar ways, but in a very decentralized way. And I think a lot of that came out of this idea of stewardship, is taking care of our own immediate needs, but taking care of the needs of others too.
Marcia, what's a good Earthling?
Well, I come back to Aldo Leopold. I don't know if people are as aware of him worldwide as we are in Wisconsin. He lived and wrote in Wisconsin for many years, but a great environmental thinker. Wrote a Sand County Almanac, which was published posthumously in 1948, which is amazing. And he had the idea of the land ethic. And I'll quote him because I think that this is a good answer to Ian's question about what is a good Earth citizen. So he says, an ethic philosophically is a differentiation of social from antisocial conduct. An ethic ecologically is a limitation on freedom of action in the struggle for existence. These are two definitions of one thing. The thing has its origin in the tendency of interdependent individuals or groups to evolve modes of cooperation. And then he goes on and defines what he means by the land ethic, and this is his definition. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. And to me, that's a very powerful and simple metric, and can be a way of using the idea of Earth citizen or Earthling in a way that addresses social injustice, because it calls out people like CEOs as criminals, as behaving antisocially and unethically. And so to me, that's a powerful way of translating our understanding of the natural world into something like reparations, I suppose. In terms of environmental injustices. So I always come back to Leopold and I just think, wow, he was there 70 years ago and said it about as eloquently as anyone.
Yeah, I keep coming back to something that we're developing through the Broto project, this idea of a bank of nature, the idea of why is it not commonplace for nature to get a dividend or some sort of return on investment for all of the extraction of wealth that industry has taken from nature, with diminishing resources, especially. Cori, did you want to add in anything about what makes a good Earthling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to hold multiple threads here, but follow up on what Marcia was saying too about CEOs maybe would be criminal. I think we could boil that down even further and say humans might be criminal then, if we're actually accounting for the imbalance or the degradation for other creatures and forms of life too, that we are now the species that is the most culpable. But I think back to indigenous knowledges, and I was with the question and the line of conversation thinking about some Eastern philosophies, and there are so many different frameworks, worldviews that put emphasis on the inherent value of balance and harmony and being able to maintain that equilibrium that I think is, I would venture to say, something I think we could bet on as a pretty safe approach, given that it does span cultures, centuries, ideologies, traditions, even religions, to say that there tends to be a thematic similarity around balance and harmony. Where that doesn't come into play, in the back of my head, was about capitalism and the drive for growth. And so when you talk about a bank and dividends and who's getting the interest off of this payment for resources and all that kind of stuff, or the extraction, those are, I think, completely counter values, because it's the values of capitalism, which are reflected in things like colonization and imperialism that have affected humans in our human history in the past couple centuries or more. Those reflect values that do not hold equilibrium and balance, but perpetual expansion, development, growth, amassing, collecting, hoarding, and this kind of more building rather than maintaining balance. And so I think that the economic shift is going to be integral to kind of an ideological reframing that we could touch into through a lot of different venues. But I think that capitalism is also going to be something that has to go if we're going to save the planet.
I just wanted to add to Cori's comment, Edward Abbey's famous quote that growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of a cancer cell.
Well, there's no coming back from that. Nation states, border conflicts, patriotism, jingoism, these are all based debatably on national security concerns. An Earthling strikes me as quite opposite of that, and someone whose civic obligations are different. Are Earthlings different than nationalists? Is a human distinct from an Earthling? How and why might that be important? Rick, do you want to go first? Are your kids nationalists or Earthlings?
I think they're probably more Earthlings than nationalists, and possibly that is because of the makeup of the kids I have in this school in Provincetown in particular. It's a very diverse group. We have students from about a dozen different countries enrolled here, and we all sort of blend together. And many of my students, even if they've lived in the United States for a long time, still identify themselves with a different identity, an identity more of a home, be that Jamaica or Honduras or Mexico or something like that. But my question is, how do we broaden that so that instead of being stuck to one geographical or one political or one cultural place, we broaden that to a planetary identity? And I think that's what it takes to get to that point of calling yourself an Earthling.
Marcia's had experience with that, I think, through your geology classes, through your art-sci classes, that your one goal is to get them to write an essay about being an Earthling or something to that effect. Why don't you explain?
Well, I mean, that's what I do every day, breathing, thinking about rocks and deep time and everything. And I try to inculcate my students with that same feeling that they are part of this amazing, still unfolding planetary story. But if I could take the question in a little bit of a different direction, would that be okay?
Yeah, of course.
I think that one way that we can overcome, or if nationalism is pitted against international thinking or global thinking or being an Earthling, sometimes we can actually leverage the discord between political boundaries and natural boundaries in a good way. And an example in the Great Lakes region here, I'm in Wisconsin, is the Great Lakes Accord. And I'm not sure if people are aware of this. It's a binational, I don't know if it's really a treaty, but it's an agreement between the states and the provinces in Canada that border the Great Lakes. So there are 8 Great Lakes states and 2 provinces, because Quebec is part of it as part of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it's an acknowledgement that this is a shared resource of international consequence, hugely important both to the natural and economic health of the region. And it was put in place as a guard against major transfer of water, frankly, out of the Great Lakes Basin to arid regions that could happen at some time in the future. And it's not clear whether, if it were ever seriously challenged in the federal courts in the United States or Canada, whether it would stand up. But it is a binational agreement that is based on both countries and the smaller jurisdictions agreeing this is such an important part of the identity of this region that we need to do everything we can to protect it. And so I think there are hopeful cases where, in spite of the ways we've divided up the globe in a rather arbitrary manner, the natural environment looms large in the awareness of people culturally, socially, economically, in ways that can be leveraged into the right kind of action.
That's very hopeful. Cori, is there a distinction between an Earthling and a human? Or another question, another way to ask the question, what is a human in the climate crisis? How do we define that?
Is that where we talked about the cancer?
Yeah.
I've actually just caught on the idea of the national security being a major motivator for these kind of distinctions, and I don't know if that's actually true with like the jingoism and everything else. I think that there's a lot more that has been arbitrarily created out of notions of domination and power that can be then justified in terms of national security, but I wouldn't say it was national security first, as if we're under threat. That's why I was saying like our differences are paying attention to how we have historically identified who we are and who others are, and thus who we care about or who we are loyal to or who we protect or who we dispose of are really parts of patterns of ideological thinking that I think serve to justify our bad behavior more than be the predecessor that causes us to do bad things. So I'm in a loop there, like on the premise of the question. So I'll just pause that.
And I want to acknowledge for all of our viewers from all over the world that we are broadcasting from America. But I grew up in Canada, and I grew up with American imperialism through my television screen. And when I say jingoism, there is a very American sentiment to the communications emanating from this region to all the other places. And we do have more than 30 countries represented as our attendees, and we've got a panelist. So we got panelists from Australia, South Africa, India, Sweden this time. So we're totally global, trying to be that Earthling idea. I do want to acknowledge that there are places outside of America, and that we are sitting in a very privileged place, as much as there is discord and challenges. But that's something I just want to acknowledge for everybody, especially since we are trying to talk to a multicultural audience. So any response to any of that?
No, I think I'm glad you mentioned it, since this is the kickoff panel to set the stage to know that we're all located in the United States, but that doesn't mean that the issues are or the perspectives are. The other thing, the question of like Earthling or human is catching me too. But I'm thinking back to all the stuff that I have studied about global citizenship and global ethics and a cosmopolitan approach. And I think that there is something important about what human actors are doing and thus how we could respond. So I think the responsibility that we have situates us differently from other creatures, but I don't think that significantly differentiates us if we're using the term Earthling to be kind of the comprehensive way of thinking about the subjects for whom we care in our decision making.
Yeah, we do have other panels that are going to get into multi-species citizenship. So that's going to be on the program as well. So tune in for that, actually the next one. Might global citizenship be a key to unlocking our climate impasse? If you agree with me that there's a climate impasse.
Again, it's essential. Sorry,
yeah,
Rick, go ahead.
No, Marcia, I would say the same thing. It's essential. I think the concept of nationalism is antithetical to what we need to have. It's that is, the idea of nationalism is really based on a philosophy of scarcity and providing enough for one particular population, and if it's at the expense of another, then so be it. But that's what's gotten us here. That's certainly not going to get us where we need to be. It's certainly not going to get us further. To take it back to an earlier point about the COVID response, that was a really good example of what could be done, where borders and nations, and even though there's still bickering over resources and allocation of vaccines or whatnot, the recognition of the shared need is universal. Yeah, go ahead.
I know I was going to say, I know Marcia had a point, but you reminded me of this idea of privilege, and that the idea that the COVID response and people who got vaccines were tended to be people of privilege first because of their access or their friends or their money. And that the COVID crisis seems to have made very stark what we already knew, which was that there is disparity and a lack of justice. And I only see this as a dress rehearsal for climate. And that the idea that some of these, the distribution of resources, et cetera, are going to become even more like a vaccine program in COVID, in the climate crisis. So, Marcia, what were you going to say?
Well, Rick said it well. I guess the only other thought I have is that changing our perception of ourselves to Earthlings is humbling in a good way. It creates a better sense of who's really in charge, the planet or us. And frankly, with the climate crisis, we're not going to be in charge, and it will affect different people disparately and unjustly. But that's really the point I try to make, is we are too enamored of our technologies and too fascinated by our own constructs, and we're ignoring the fact that we are relinquishing control over our futures, and a little humility is urgently needed.
Yeah, the tragedy of the commons. The biggest one is the future. So nobody owns it. We might as well contribute to it. Cori, any thoughts before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I'm thinking, let's see, two things if I can hold them. One is about the COVID vaccine response as an example. I think that's really compelling. I'm pretty sure I heard just today that Haiti still hasn't received any vaccines. So when we talk about as a kind of dress rehearsal for the ways in which the climate crisis will continue to disproportionately affect certain groups, there are historical reasons for why some people are being neglected, left out, and then left to bear the brunt of suffering and destruction and a loss of life, and others are not. So privilege and power is, I think, core to notions of justice, but I think equity. So when we think of from a global perspective about how to approach Earthlings, an equitable approach, meaning the focus and the priority going to those who have been unequally, inequitably affected by the consequences of our actions, that's a necessity. But because Marcia had brought up CEOs, man, you really planted that seed in my head. I'm now thinking about the pandemic as another example too. It's like, yeah, we had this global response and everybody has been affected by it in some way across the world. And who made billions and billions of dollars off of it? So I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but like, I think our aspirational ways of humbling ourselves and thinking about these things are important. And then on the other side, there are really nasty, ugly demonstrations of how really in trouble we are. And so if we're thinking about citizenship and global citizenship, and we can use the United States as an example, of like, well, then what counts as a citizen? Because I just have been situating us as humans being the responsible party, but we as humans are citizens in our country. Some people are not granted citizenship and then are often seen as less than human. But then you have corporations and all of the kind of like complicated historical conversations we've had over the recent decades of the role of corporations on a global level. What is the role of corporate presence and responsibility and decision making? If we are global citizens, then are there global corporate citizens too? So it seems like there's always just that other upper echelon or the realm that just escapes the consequences or the full consideration of when we're trying to talk about ourselves and relate to each other in a more humane and compassionate way. I think that has to be all encompassing, where we really rein in the powers that supersede those kinds of considerations and are somehow exempt from them. And that's our responsibility to do that then.
Yeah, the corporation is the one fact that started out as a fiction. It's a construct that has taken on a life. It's been given life. Citizens United, it's immortal. It outlasts its humans. Has different priorities. I think the corporate citizen is very much relevant to this conversation, and it's going to be a struggle because that's where our allegiance is. It's not with nature. One of the things that I've been looking at is democracy, flawed democracy, the idea that more than 50% of the population of the world lives, or almost 50% live in some sort of democracy. And that the COVID crisis, for instance, certainly highlighted what freedom was, especially in the US. And I was thinking, what is freedom as a thing? And could Earthlings or Earthlingisms have more or less of it? Marcia?
Well, again, I picked up Leopold this week, and in the first pages, he defines freedom. I don't know if people remember this. He starts with a little mouse that's making tunnels under the snow. And he says, freedom is the absence of want and fear. And I think that's a pretty powerful and simple way of thinking about freedom. It's being able to thrive in your environment without the constant shadow of starving or being afraid. And I think if we start from that, and I would add, it means having the promise of growing up in a resilient and healthy world where you can be sure that you're going to have what you need and thrive. So that's maybe a working definition.
Rick, how are kids looking at freedom, and whether do they think it's a thing?
I think the nature of kids is to always feel that they want to be free and that someone is constraining them and preventing their freedom and curtailing.
Usually their parents or teachers, right?
It's one of us being the bad guy and saying you can't do this and you can't do that. Marcia, I'm so glad you bring up Aldo Leopold and Edward Abbey. Those are some favorites in my life as well. But I think when it comes to freedom, there's also constraints to that freedom, and living within a living planet. If we think of something along the lines of James Lovelock and Gaia theory, that if we live in a living planet, then we are part of that. I forget who it was. Maybe it may have been Aldo Leopold or one of the other greats who said, "Nature bats last."
Sure
Nature
does.
has the final word on growth, and that's like the parent or the teacher putting the constraint on the freedom.
Cori, I'm going to give you the last word. Is there such a thing as responsible or curated freedom? Something that blends the idea of freedom with stewardship, maybe?
This is my most exciting opportunity to put on my philosopher hat, because I think about freedom all the time, and one of the best frameworks, I root myself in existentialist frameworks, and Simone de Beauvoir actually wrote, I think, one of the most compelling and instructive frameworks for us to be thinking about what it means to think about freedom in an ethical way. And so in her book, which is really a lecture from 1942, The Ethics of Ambiguity, she acknowledges that we have an existential freedom as being human subjects, where we have the choice and the responsibility to make meaning out of our lives through the projects that we pursue. This is very standard existentialism. But if everybody has their existential freedom to pursue their own projects and make their choices to create a meaningful life, pretty soon we're going to bump up against each other. And that's where you come up with constraints. So humans, in her introduction to the ethics of ambiguity, she'll say we are capable of creating amazing masterpieces and art and wonderful things, and also the atomic bomb, or just tons and tons of fishing nets to pollute our oceans and destroy the seas. So we're capable of creating our projects that promote real well-being and more life and more freedom. And we're capable of cutting off freedom by killing each other and killing ourselves. And so that's the ambiguity of it. So the ethical framework, and why I think it's so amazing, is that it's super simple. Our responsibility is to utilize our existential freedom to pursue projects that open up more freedom, rather than use our freedom to curtail, truncate, shut off, undermine, deny other freedoms.
I think that's a fantastic place to stop. Just a word to our viewers that we're going to pop up in a second to answer questions live and continue the conversation for the balance of the time. And something new this time for our attendees is we're going to do a post-panel mingle. So we're going to get a chance for you guys to have a conversation with each other about some of these ideas. So that's something to look forward to. I want to say thank you to our guests, and we'll see you in a second or two as we pop up and answer a lot of questions. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you're logged in. We are live now to answer questions, continue the conversation. I appreciate your patience as we had people logging in late. I just wanted to start to say thank you to our guests and thank you for kicking this off. Is there any response to the video since we last did this? Everybody's on mute. Nope. Marcia?
Well, hi, Ian and Cori and Rick. Good to see you again. Yeah, I was able to listen more closely than I could when we were having the conversation, and I came away with the sense that what we were really talking about is the struggle to align natural law and human law, or the ways that we structure human power, I suppose. And that's the rub, that we somehow have to work with both. We have to work with the human constructs, which from a scientific perspective are often arbitrary, but we those are the things that we use to govern ourselves, and we need to somehow align the two systems, which are fractal, they're global, they're regional, they're national, they're local, and interact in all kinds of ways. But we have to use the leverage of the marketplace and of governance structures that we have in a way that aligns with nature, finally.
Rick?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot also, and it's also good to see you all again too, but of all places, Saturday Night Live last week had Elon Musk on, and he kept talking about being a multiplanetary species, and I just struggle with that idea so much, based on just reviewing our conversation we had last time. We're not doing a very good job even with one. How dare we try and do that on another? And as as a science teacher, I admire the technology that's developed for space exploration. I think that exploration is worthwhile, but the idea that we can somehow export human culture, and then that brings up the question of whose culture, which humans. Certainly it's not going to be the poorest among us. It's going to be the wealthiest, and we're in a point now where we have the wealthiest people in the world competing for their own private space programs. It's just mind-boggling what at one hand what we've achieved, but on the other hand, what are we leaving behind, and what's left on the table?
Cori, why don't you have any thoughts about what our video said?
Hi everyone, good to see you. Yes. Marcia, I appreciate you saying we were able to listen more closely. I noticed that too. And I love when the flow of a conversation feels so organic that as you're listening to it, you're kind of going along with it. And so you're following a good path. So that was my experience listening to it again. I think for me, I'm really grateful that we touched on the themes of justice as the weeks have gone by since our recording. I think on a global scale, issues of justice and inequity, of human conflict, whether that's because of culture or because of the pandemic, because of governmental structures or state violence against citizens in different countries, it has just continued and ramped up. And so I think, Elon Musk being on SNL is also just some kind of moment to hold on to, the controversy around that and the attitudes that we have of how we can, I think maybe a theme that's coming up for me is this like escapist dream, that there's this fantasy of being able to leave or deny what's really going on or ignore it. And I think that to me is becoming more and more and more fundamental every day if it comes to actually being able to realize any semblance of justice. And like I said in the recording too, I think justice is going to be necessary if we're going to have any kind of sustainability. And just looking around, I mean, it's been a wild 15 months, 2 years, depending on where you are, and the issues just are more striking and more salient. So the whatever hope we can get, I think, is going to be found by really rooting ourselves into some fundamental values, and it's not going to be by running away or escaping or ignoring or denying the realities.
If we have any, sorry, just 1 second. If we have any viewers who are listening in and have questions, you can certainly ask them in the chat, and I encourage you to do so. Marcia, what were you going to say?
I just wanted to, I had jotted down and taking notes on the recording just now, Cori's statement that we need justice for sustainability, but paradoxically, we need sustainability for justice. So that's what I mean. They're tangled up with each other because our human systems have co-evolved with the state of the natural world. And so it's especially difficult repair job. Both are broken, both need fixing. And they are, for now, governed by sort of different rules. And we have to align those rules. So when we're repairing one, we're repairing the other too.
Rick, what have we answered the question, what is an Earthling?
I don't know. I don't know that we have. I think it's becoming a more flexible definition in some ways. We can expand that if we go into sort of the deep ecology, interconnected sort of view of things, where an Earthling, everything is part of the planet. And maybe Homo sapiens are one aspect of that, but also keeping in mind that we're one species amongst tens of millions of species that inhabit this planet too.
One of the observations I've made, having done now 8 of these sessions, is that we understand the macro, that we need to be Earthlings, or we need to have a united approach to something like climate. But the more micro you get, the more division you get. So it's very interesting when we talk about mental health or sociology or some of these aspects of what it means to be a person in climate, that we get such a disparity of opinions, which is probably part of the problem. I think Earthling is a great idea. I would like to think it's aspirational. Anyway, Cori, you want to chime in on any of these points about our 1%ers who have the biggest carbon footprint in the world?
I really like the connection that's being made around that. I think it goes to the discussion we had on corporations and thinking about citizenship in that framework. Also capitalism. And I think to add even more nuance to the language that was in the recording, I've been thinking more about racial capitalism, and just to kind of show how those are connected systems. And then we didn't mention it. I said a lot about indigenous knowledges in the recording, but I think another way to understand what needs to happen for real justice and sustainability is to decolonize. And that I don't want to just keep throwing language out there, but that to me is like a real important shift in our understanding of our world, our relationships, our values, and a thorough decolonization would need to happen on a global level too. And we didn't talk about it again, all these things. We're touching on these threads. I think white supremacy is another piece of it. And so when we talk about climate capitalism, racial capitalism. We mentioned environmental justice before, and that didn't make it into the edits of the recording, but these are all going hand in hand. And so if we really are looking for pathways, we have them through decolonial strategies and challenging white supremacy and global capitalism. So the fact that the 1% has the biggest carbon footprint, no kidding, right? Like, it's not surprising. And I do think that can be a little distracting, though, for thinking just about responsibility, where clearly the biggest players with the largest impact have, I think, significant responsibility, but we all have responsibility to be shifting and getting involved and moving our practices in ways that we can.
We don't have someone on our panel who is explicitly an artist, although Cori is a writer. So I'm going to defer to her for some of this, but I would like to think about how art actually explores some of these ideas of Earthling. And maybe this is something for our attendees to chime in on just before we wrap up in a couple of minutes to go to the discussion, after panel discussion.
I love these cue ups at the end. I got so excited in the recording, like, yeah, you're going to talk about existentialist ethics. And now, in the weeks that have since passed, why I love existentialism is that it's about that project and choosing how we direct our freedom. And something that clicked for me in the weeks since is that really creativity is an antidote to capitalism. That if we think about why pursue something and challenge that impulse for growth, expansion, consumerism, and the kind of capitalist energy that we were naming in the recording, what can we do to continue to progress or evolve and advance ourselves without that being rooted to the end of profit and capital? And for me, creativity becomes really the value of how we can express our freedom for the sake of freedom without it being utilizing our existential freedom to damage and undermine others. That something that's creative is inherently something that can open up more freedom, and we can use creativity in a similar parallel. Creativity for the sake of more creativity, I think, is something that's accessible to us. When we talk about innovation and change, we're really talking about that creative energy. And so art is a big umbrella term that I think we can actually couch more in creativity as a value that can be that antidote to capitalism.
And could I add to that? I would say creativity is an intrinsic property of Earth. It's an immensely creative planet that has reinvented itself many times over. It's invented rocks and minerals that don't exist anywhere else, including Elon Musk on Mars. And the huge biodiversity over time, that's creativity. So again, we can look to Earth as a kind of mentor there as well.
Just before we close, I want to acknowledge a question by Charlie Owen about what are our ways to divert ourselves from capitalism. And again, because we've done such a social science focus on this particular program, I've really discovered that this is a much more personal question than it is an economic question. And we have people who recycle and compost and all those kinds of things, which are helpful. But I think that in order to sort of believe we are Earthlings, we have to accept, to use our colleague Rich Blundell's idea, that we accept that we are a friend of Earth, we are part of Earth, we are Earth. I wanted to say, again, thank you to all of our people, attendees. Apologies for anybody who had trouble getting logged in. We will have this on tape in a couple of days. And I invite you, all of you, to move on to the post-panel mingle space that we're trying to set up so we can continue this conversation as we go. So I will see you. Thank you very much, Rick, Marcia, and Cori, and we'll see you in the post-panel mingle. We'll try that. Thanks.